Hello, so this is a double response video to Vince Venturella's airbrush video, but also to MC1Gamer's video on why he doesn't have an airbrush. You both make some really good points, and I'd like to give you a third perspective, and I would title mine "Why I Don't Use an Airbrush Very Often." Now, I'm not out for sympathy, but one thing I do make clear is obviously my job, being a living carer. I go to people's houses, so my setup is very different from everybody else's. So I don't get to use a lot of the equipment that I like to use, but also I find airbrushes quite impractical. I'm going to go through all the four main points. Now, everything that I buy, I always ask four questions. First of all, there's time. Is it saving me time in a practical way? Is it saving me money? I don't mind spending money on something that will eventually save money. What are the benefits to using that particular piece of equipment? And what are the alternatives? And then that will lead to the question, what's the overall effect? So first of all, I'm going to deal with time. Now, Vince, you've said that it saves you a lot of time, and yes, that is correct. But I'm going to give you an analogy. A few years ago, I used to travel to work on a motorbike. The journey by car took me 45 minutes. The journey by bike used to take me 35 minutes. So you say, well, hey, brilliant, that saved me 10 minutes. However, when I got in my car, I just used to literally just jump in, off I go, drive, park the car, start work. With the motorbike, I would have to get into my motorbike gear. I would then have to take my work clothes with me. I'd get the bike out, I would start it up, I'd have to let it run for a couple of minutes, and then off I go. And then obviously things like traffic lights, I would just weave to the front, and that would save me 10 minutes. Once I got into work, I'd have to get out of my motorbike gear. I'd then have to put it all in the locker or somewhere safe, then put all my work clothes on. So in actual fact, I didn't save any time whatsoever. However, the overall effect was that I was relaxed when I got to work because I love riding my motorbike, and then obviously I had a nice journey home. So in that particular instance, it was worth it. Now, it sounds a bit of a daft analogy, but with an airbrush, first of all, you've got to set the airbrush up. Whereas, let me give you an example. If I'm painting with a pot, there you go, I'm now ready to paint. With an airbrush, I've got to get the airbrush out. I'll show you my setup. This is my airbrush. So, to set my airbrush up, first of all, I need a plug socket. So I've got to find a plug socket. So that means that if there's no plug socket near where I'm painting, I've got to move where I'm actually painting. So I'll go into this, but this is the, I think they call this the elephant, because as you can see it looks like an elephant. And this is the actual airbrush. It comes as a little set. I will go into it more once I get into the money section. So it's going to take me a few minutes to set that airbrush up. And then once I'm painting, obviously it's quicker to paint with an airbrush than it is with a brush. Not a problem there. But then once I've finished painting, obviously I've got to dismantle the airbrush, I've got to clean it. So that's going to take a good few minutes. So this is my latest unpainted model. Excuse me, I'm going to focus. Still not going to work. This is actually the Slaughter Priest. Now, ask yourself the question, by the time I got, if that was all I need to prime, by the time I got the airbrush out, is it worth it? One figure. I say no. If I was to buy, I don't know, let's say I need to build 3 units of bloodletters, so it's 3 boxes, 10 in each box, 30. get them all out, yeah, that's definitely going to be worth it. So time element, you've got to work out, it's not just a case of off you go, spray. Money, now money, this particular airbrush, it's like the one that you had on your video, Vince. This cost me £10, £15, it was definitely less than £20, which in your money is about $30. It comes with a bottle. This is the reason I bought the bottle, was because when I bought this I knew nothing about airbrushes, and what the plan was to get these bottles and I can pre-make paints, and then obviously all I do is I just screw the paint on and then off I go. But a lot of people were telling me you're best off with a cup. Now obviously I've not used either, so I didn't know which was which. As I've used it, I've found that I'd use the cup, and then what I do is I buy these little dropper bottles and I pre-mix the paint in the dropper bottles. That's a big time saver. Oops. Now, I say this cost me about £10, £20, and the compressor slightly more expensive. I think that was about £20, £30. It really wasn't a very expensive setup. It's not brilliant. The compressor, it works on, there's two settings, on and off. So none of this complicated pounds per square inch settings and this, that and the other. And the airbrush, it is a dual action. For the benefit of those that don't know what a dual action is, you have a trigger, you press it down to trigger the air and you pull it back to trigger the paint. So if you press it down a little bit and pull it back a tiny bit, you get low air pressure and not an awful lot of paint. Whereas if you push it fully and pull it all the way back, you get a lot of paint and a lot of air, and then obviously you've got all the combinations in between. Sounds complicated, but actually it's not. It's just one of those things you get used to. Now, in terms of money, it's actually saved me money. I don't think I've recouped the cost of the airbrush just yet, but it does save me money. And then first of all, this is the primer I use. Normally I use Games Workshop paints. As you'll see in all my videos, I'll be picking up these little pots. I don't think do Games Workshop do primers? I think they do. They do a grey one, don't they? Smelly primer or something. But they do the rattle cans, which I'll get into later. Now these bottles, this particular one is 60 millilitres and it costs about £6, £10 compared to what's Games Workshop 12mm for £2.50. So the saving, and if you bought a bigger bottle of this, I think you can buy 250ml. Obviously the cost per millilitre goes down even more. I buy these because they fit into my toolbox nicely. Remember, with me it's all about space. Now this bottle I've had it about 6 months, it's down to about there. I actually thin this a little bit. I prime the same way that I paint, which is thin layers. I can always put a second layer on, and it's just, you'll probably decide, ignore what I just said there because it might be totally wrong. So I've got my primer and I've got my airbrush. Now the second place it saves me money, I showed you this bottle. Now I'm painting away with me Citadel paints, paint. Now, as everybody knows, when you get to the bottom of the bottle, you're always going to get that little bit that you cannot get out. So what I do is, once I get down to about a fifth of a pot left, I then thin it down, because when you airbrush you have to thin the paints down because it's too thick to go through the airbrush. So what I'll do is I'll put a load of thinners into this, and then I'll give it a good old shake, and then obviously the consistency is a little bit close, well, milk, and then I'll pour it into the bottle. These bottles cost £5 for 100, and then obviously, so what I'm actually doing by using the airbrush, I'll actually be using that little bit bottom of the paint that you would normally just throw away. I will now use it, I'll pour it into there, and now I've got a nice dropper bottle for my airbrush. I don't do that with all my paints. This is one of the colours I can't pronounce, Mephiston Red, and there's only two instances where I actually airbrush. One is priming, and the other one is base coating. Now, so the setup cost. Now, however, with regards to setup costs, I may mention that this isn't particularly awesome. You'll probably see some YouTube videos where people are painting fine details. You cannot do that with this. You get quite a thick line come out. So to get a really good airbrush, you're going to have to be spending about £300, which is what, $400 or $500. I mean, that's a top of the range airbrush. But obviously that's... Now, Vince, you showed us a model and it had some really nice shading, and you said it's really easy with a brush, with an airbrush. Yeah, fine. I'm a beginner. I can't even do that with a brush, so I've got no hope with an airbrush. So you got to think, I think, what you're going to be able to use it for. Now, this airbrush will sit here until I'm better. But yeah, so that's the money. The alternatives, there's two alternatives. One is, as you call it, a rattle can. We call it a spray can. I'm not a tree hugger, eco warrior, but I don't like to buy rattle cans because, first of all, you've probably half of the cost of your rattle can is the actual can that the paint comes into. They're not cheap to make, I suspect, and then what you're going to do is you're going to end up with an aerosol can that's empty that you're going to throw in the trash can. That's an awful lot of waste. I mean, I'll throw away what I need to throw away, but do you really need to be going through rattle cans? And they're very expensive, and like I say, probably half of that cost at least is for the metal, and I think that's an awful lot of waste of money. To give you a bit of a background, the way I was brought up is, I think the Americans call it thrifty. Don't spend money when you don't need to. I'll give you a good example. I was looking after a lady a couple of months ago, and someone had said, oh, get her an activity, and we talked about Skittles or bowling, and one of the relatives was prepared to go out and buy a little indoor bowling set, and I said no need for that. And what we did is we made a day of the activity. We got some like little drink bottles, the half-litre ones, and we filled them up with soil, and we screwed them on, and then we taped them down, and we painted them different colours, and we had good fun painting. And then we made some bowling balls, and for about £2 or £3 we made a little indoor 10-pin bowling set, and that's the kind of the way that I work. Rather than go out and spend 20, 30, 40 pounds on something, I'll look at making it for pennies or pounds. So rattle cans for me is a no-no, because I just think they're a lot of money for what you get, and I think they're harder to control. The second alternative is brush. Now, for some reason, people get shocked at this. Quite often, when I prime, this is my palette. I use spoons as palettes. These are just something I pick up from cafes and things. And what I'll do is I'll just pop a little bit of paint in there, and I'll brush the primer on. I haven't got. There we go. This is a skull throne I'm working on. Just bring that into focus. No, it's not going to come into focus. I do apologise, but this is the front wheel off a skull throne, and I've just dropped a piece off. And I've primed it with a brush, and the result is fine. But I do slightly overthin my paints when I prime with a brush. And I find that this particular primer, this is Vallejo Surface Primer, it's really, really forgiving. If you slapped it on too thick, you still don't really lose the detail. You don't want to slap it on thick, but if you accidentally do, it kind of forgives. So brushing is an alternative. The benefits is obviously it's quicker if you're doing a lot. If you're doing the actual painting is quicker. Like I say, I've gone through using a rattle can. Does it make you a better painter? I don't think so. I firmly believe that anything you can do with an airbrush you can do with a brush. It may take longer, but there are separate benefits of taking longer. One of my series that I'm working on is painting on a budget, and one of the things I shall be going into is the cost of the model versus the time it takes. I despite all the equipment I buy, I am actually on quite a strict budget. Now, if I bought £50 worth of models, and because £50 would be my budget, say for example, and I paint them all in 3 days, then I'm sitting there for 4 days bored solid. And actually, in actual fact, I probably need about £120 a week at the rate I'm painting. If I go out and I bought a £100 model and it took me 3 weeks to paint, then with the time it takes me to paint, it's much better value, because although I'm going over budget by £50, the next 2 weeks I'm not spending any money, so I'm actually £50 up over the 3 weeks. So taking longer isn't a bad thing, and I think if you take longer you can put more effort in. I don't know, I just think that an airbrush just takes a bit of skill away. You talk about hipsters. To be honest with you, I think that's invalid in the sense that anyone with half a brain just tends to ignore negative comments that people make. As we've seen on other videos, response videos to things that you've made, everybody's in this hobby for their own reason, and the reasons vary. And I'm pretty sure that most of us have come across people that go, "Oh, you just paint toy soldiers. That's a bit of a funny thing for an adult." And obviously, just don't bother. The other benefit I find is the drying time is better, because you're blowing air, and with a dual action brush you can if you push the trigger forward but still have the air down, you're actually drying, and because the paint is thinner, it's not blowing the paint off. Thin layers with lots of air. People say when you're doing batch painting, if you paint 10 models, by the time you finish the 10th one, you can go back to the first one and then do the next colour. With airbrushing, if you're doing a substantially sized model, and you start at the top, for example, and you work down, quite often by the time you got to the bottom, the top is dry again to give a second coat, if you need a second coat. Yeah, now one comment that MC Gamer made was he's always up for upping his game. I think that stands true with all of us. To be honest with you, I don't think an airbrush is going to up your game. If anything, initially it's going to lower your standard, because obviously where you've been using a brush for so many years, you're quite good at a brush, and now suddenly you're using an airbrush which you're not so good at, and then as you get better, your standard comes back up, and then obviously it could exceed. There are instances, for example, the shading is very good with an airbrush. So yes, you can up your game, but you're not going to pick up an airbrush and then suddenly boom, unless you're good at airbrushes. The price, yeah, now Vince says you can get cheap airbrushes, and I've proven, hey, yeah, you can get cheap airbrushes, but cheap isn't better. Now my granny always used to say, buy cheap, buy twice, and that is the case. Now this airbrush that I've got is only really any good for painting large areas. If I want to get into fine detail, it's not going to work, so I'm going to have to go out and buy another airbrush. Once I've bought another airbrush, I'm going to need a better compressor so that I can control all the air and all the things that go with it. So I'm probably going to spend about £300 to £400 on a setup. So I'm buying twice. So the last thing that I mentioned is the overall effect. Now that takes into account the time, the money, the alternatives, and the overall benefit. I hardly use my airbrush because for the time that it takes me, you're going to waste paint because you're going to have paint in. So you need to spray more paint than you're actually going to wash out of the airbrush. So when I come to prime this, unless I can have about 20 models on the go, I'm not going to bother airbrushing. When it comes to doing a large unit, yeah, the airbrush will come out, and then I'll prime it, and then I'll base coat it, and then I'll do the rest of it with a brush. An airbrush is good. Obviously this is only an opinion. The airbrush is good. It saves time when you're doing a lot. It does save paint. Let's say the little dribbles that you get in the bottom of the pot, you don't need to throw them away anymore. All you need to do is just chuck in loads and loads of thinner, give it a really, really good shake, and then once it's pouring consistency, you can pour it out the bottle and give it a go. So once again, I thank Vince for his most awesome video topics. MC Wargamer, your response is brilliant. Just going off topic a bit, MC Wargamer, all your videos are brilliant. You're one of the guys that I get notification on my tablet. MC Gamer has uploaded. I kind of get a bit excited about that. So thanks for watching this video. It's gone on a bit, isn't it? Was it 23 minutes? So yeah, that's my response. Thank you very much.